Okay, so today's lesson is on 8.2, which is blood and circulation. All right, so what is blood? Blood is a connective tissue, all right, because it links all the cells and organs in the body, so it's considered a tissue, even though it appears to be a fluid. And it consists of two distinct elements. There's the fluid portion, and then there's the solid portion. So the plasma of the blood, that's the fluid portion. It consists of water plus any dissolved gases, proteins and sugars, vitamins, minerals, hormones, and waste products. And plasma makes up about 55% of the blood volume. All right, so plasma, that's the fluid portion. And then the formed portion, it's the solid portion of the blood. So this is the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets. So these cells and platelets are produced in the bone marrow, which is found inside the bones. And the formed portion makes up the other 45% of the blood volume. All right, so 55% is the fluid, and then 45% is this solid portion. All right, so here we're just taking a look at this diagram. It's just showing here's the plasma, the 55%, the fluid portion of blood. Here is the formed portion of blood. So red blood cells make up 44%, and then the white blood cells and the platelets make up about 1%. All right, and these three main components of blood can be separated using a special medical device. It's called a blood centrifuge. And when the blood then it's spun really, really fast in this centrifuge, and then when the blood is separated, it briefly settles into these layers that are shown here. Okay, so we're going to talk about the formed portion of blood. We're going to talk about the red blood cells. The name for red blood cells is erythrocytes. All right, make sure you know that term for red blood cells. It makes up approximately 44% of the total volume of blood. It's specialized for oxygen transport. So the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood is dependent on the number of erythrocytes that are present and the amount of hemoglobin that each red blood cell contains. Another important fact about red blood cells is that they do not have a nucleus, and the reason being is to carry as much oxygen as possible. Hemoglobin allows large quantities of oxygen to be transported in the blood because it has special properties that allow it to pick up or chemically bind with the oxygen. All right, so hemoglobin releases the oxygen by the process of diffusion in the presence of cells that require it. And hemoglobin also transports some of the carbon dioxide waste from cells. After the carbon dioxide diffuses into the blood, it enters the red blood cells, where a small amount is taken up by hemoglobin. All right, so here we can see what red blood cells look like. So red blood cells, again, which are called erythrocytes. It's a biconcave disc. All right, so it's caved in. And then the respiratory pigment, hemoglobin, it reflects red wavelengths of light. So oxygenated red blood cells appear to be a bright red color. Once the oxygen is released, the color that is reflected, it's a darker blue-red. So just some more information about the red blood cells. The erythrocytes, they're the most plentiful cells in the blood. Biological females average about 4.8 million erythrocytes per microliter of blood, and biological males average about 5.4 million erythrocytes per microliter of blood. The number of blood cells can vary depending on health and altitude. So at higher altitudes, like in the mountains, in order to cope with those lower concentrations of oxygen, the body will increase red blood cell production. So red blood cells are responsible for the transport of oxygen and a little bit of carbon dioxide. So the hemoglobin molecule makes it possible for erythrocytes to carry oxygen. When the deoxygenated blood is pumped to the lungs, oxygen diffuses into the bloodstream and will bind to the hemoglobin. And then when hemoglobin reaches the deoxygenated tissues in the body, it's going to give up the oxygen molecule. The oxygen will diffuse into the cells to be used for cellular respiration, that final electron acceptor for cellular respiration. Okay, we know that cellular respiration produces carbon dioxide, and most carbon dioxide is transferred into the erythrocyte by diffusion, but some of the carbon dioxide will remain in the plasma. Once inside the red blood cell, about half of the carbon dioxide binds to sites on the hemoglobin molecule. The rest of that carbon dioxide will combine with water to form carbonic acid. All right, so this carbonic acid dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. The bicarbonate ions will diffuse back into the plasma. The hydrogen ions will bind to the hemoglobin molecule and therefore not increase the pH of the blood. All right, so here we can see the chemical equation of that. Then when red blood cells reach the lungs, this above reaction gets reversed. The bicarbonate ions enter the red blood cells and combine with hydrogen ions to form carbonic acid. This is broken down into carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide will diffuse out of the red blood cells and into the alveoli of the lungs, and carbon dioxide will get released as when you exhale. Okay, carbon monoxide, CO, it's a chemical produced by incomplete combustion reactions, and it has a high affinity for hemoglobin and does not readily release. So carbon monoxide can displace oxygen in the blood and with potentially fatal results. So that's why there's carbon monoxide detectors that you can put into your homes and so on as a warning system. Most vehicles have a catalytic converter to eliminate the carbon monoxide from the exhaust. Red blood cells are terminally differentiated, which means they can never divide. So they have a lifespan of about 120 days. The liver and spleen cells will ingest blood cells at the end of their life cycles, and then the iron from the hemoglobin is reabsorbed into the body. The rest of that blood cell is degraded into bile pigments and then which are secreted by the liver. Anemia is a condition that occurs if there are too few red blood cells or too little hemoglobin inside the red blood cells in the bloodstream. And it reduces the amount of oxygen that's flowing through the body. So an anemic person may appear pale, and they're usually very tired. They experience fatigue. And anemia may be caused by a dietary deficiency of iron, which is a key component of hemoglobin. Okay, next we'll look at white blood cells. White blood cells are also called leukocytes. All right, make sure you are familiar with this term as well. So white blood cells are called leukocytes. They are part of the body's response to infection. They make up about 1% of the total blood volume, but they may increase to more than double normal levels when the body is fighting an infection. All the white blood cells have nucleus and they appear to be colorless. So here we can see a leukocyte here. Here, this is the leukocyte here. It's attacking bacteria. So these little yellow ones are the bacteria. This is the white blood cell. We can also see one red blood cell. All right, so just quick review of white blood cells. They're less numerous than red blood cells by a ratio of about 1 to 700. They do contain a nucleus. They are able to divide, unlike the red blood cells. And the function of white blood cells is to participate in protecting the body from infection. There's 3 groups of white blood cells. There are lymphocytes, monocytes, and granulocytes. The lymphocytes are B cells and T cells. B cells are responsible for making antibodies. T cells assist B cells in making the antibodies, and they kill invading viruses or other pathogens by phagocytosis. Okay, they regulate B cell response or remember returning pathogens. Monocytes leave the blood and become macrophages. Macrophages are large phagocytotic cells that can engulf and destroy foreign material that enters the body, or they will destroy dead or dying body cells. And then the granulocytes, they consist of 3 different cell types: neutrophils, the eosinophils, and the basophils. Okay, so neutrophils, most abundant of the white blood cells, they can squeeze through the capillary walls and into infected tissue where they can kill the invaders such as bacteria, and then they engulf the remnants. It's a never-ending task, even in healthy people. Their throats, nasal passages, colons will contain vast numbers of bacteria. Most of these bacteria don't harm people because neutrophils will keep the bacteria in check. But if there's, for example, somebody's undergoing radiation or chemotherapy or other forms of stress, that can reduce the number of neutrophils so that that formerly harmless bacteria begin to proliferate, and then the infection can be life-threatening. Eosinophils, they store many toxins in their granules within the cell, and these cells circulate in the body, in the blood. They'll migrate to inflamed sites or specific areas of, for example, parasitic worm infection. Unless there's an infection or a parasitic worm, the levels of eosinophils in the blood are very low. When they're needed, the eosinophil release toxic granules that will kill the invading parasite or pathogen. And then the basophils are also usually in low concentrations unless the body is fighting an infection. Basophils will leave the bloodstream and accumulate at the site of inflammation or infection. Then the contents of granules are released, which, instead of killing invaders, increase the blood flow to an area. And then increased basophil concentrations are generally evident during, for example, an allergic reaction. All right, next is that the platelets, which also make up the formed portion of blood. So the platelets, these are fragments of cells that form when larger cells in the bone marrow break apart, and these fragments contain no nucleus and they break down quickly in the blood. They play a key role in blood clotting the blood. So for example, preventing excessive blood loss after an injury so that you don't bleed out. All right, so stages of clotting. So there's an injury to a blood vessel, and it'll start this cascade of cellular events. Substances that are released by the broken blood vessel will attract platelets to the site. The collecting platelets rupture and will release chemicals that combine with other blood components to produce an enzyme called thromboplastin. Okay, as long as there are calcium ions present, calcium is important, thromboplastin will react with prothrombin, which is a plasma protein produced by the liver, and this will produce thrombin. Okay, so then thrombin is an enzyme that reacts with fibrinogen, which is another plasma protein, to produce fibrin. Fibrin is an insoluble material that forms a mesh of strands around the injured area. The mesh will trap escaping blood cells and form the clot. All right, so here's just a diagram showing the stages of clotting. So if there's a cut or a damaged tissue, these reactions get triggered by the platelets, the blood components, and the damaged tissue. Prothrombin, in the presence of calcium, produces thrombin. Again, calcium is required. And then fibrinogen will form fibrin. The fibrin threads will wind around the platelet plug in the damaged area of a blood vessel and will provide the framework for a clot. And then trapped red blood cells will make the clot appear red. So here we can see like those strands and the red blood cells. All right, and then plasma was the fluid portion of the blood in which the blood cells are suspended. Plasma also plays a role in the transport of carbon dioxide in the blood. Remember that oxygen is transported in the blood by the hemoglobin inside cells. So carbon dioxide dissolves in the water portion of the blood and it forms carbonic acid inside the cytoplasm of the red blood cells. It'll diffuse out of the red blood cells into the plasma as bicarbonate ions and is carried from tissues to the lungs for gas exchange. All right, this is just showing the composition of plasma. So about 92% of it is water, 7% are the blood proteins, 0.1% other organic substances, and then 0.9% are the inorganic ions such as calcium and so on.